But here we are again, Joe Rogan, once more, having on people to talk about Ukraine. No Ukrainians, no Klitschko, no Vitaly, no, not them. You know, those are, by the way, boxers who've offered to come on, who world champions, who are willing to talk with him. Vladimir Klitschko is a world championship boxer. So it goes from combat sports and to the topic of interest, the war in Ukraine. He can represent the Ukrainian perspective. I could not think of and he's openly offered, I could not think of a better person to go on the show and talk. Zelensky's offered. He said no. Why? Because he doesn't want to do quote unquote propaganda on his show. That's what Joe said. Okay? Doesn't want to do propaganda. But he's still going to talk about the war and bring on people that are going to do, well, we'll see if it's propaganda. Let's start with this. So first off, I want you guys to know, before we watch what we're going to watch, Elon Musk did retweet it. So don't worry, millions of people had this in their feed. So just a few people watched it. Let's go into this because, mind you, Joe Rogan won't have on Zelensky. Joe Rogan's given no indication that he's bringing on Klitschko or bringing on somebody who can help represent the Ukrainian perspective when we're a month and a half to a month and three quarters of a month away from a peace deal or something that could see a continuation of the war if the peace deal fails, which I think is definitely a likely possibility. Definitely, since the Russians seem to think that they could just push on until victory, and they seem to be trying to. Or at the very least setting themselves up for the best position in negotiations. As we're having that reality come to us, as we're having this crucial crossroads in history, this is the largest war in Europe since World War II. Joe Rogan will not have on the president of Ukraine. Okay. Joe Rogan is, as so far as we know, not having on the combat sports guys who are asking to come onto his show as the combat sports commentator and podcast host. Okay. But Joe Rogan did have this guy on. This guy. Now, this guy is Mike Benz. He's the executive director of FFO, the Foundation for Freedom Online. And he used to work for the State Department and some cyber stuff. Anyway, he's written a few books. But as far as I know, this guy has not worked that much in Ukraine. He's certainly not Ukrainian. Not holding that against him. I'm just saying that he can't provide the perspective of a Ukrainian or the Ukrainian perspective. But again, remember, Joe Rogan knows Zelensky because propaganda bad. Propaganda bad, knows Zelensky. He wants to have a clean platform. A clean platform. Let's see how they talked about the war in Ukraine with this person.
When did the government realize that they had to get actively involved in censorship, and what steps did they initially take to get involved in this?
It started in 2014 with the Ukraine fiasco, the coup and then the counter coup.
Okay. I don't want to get too picky. The question is, when did the US government get started with internet censorship? And the answer is 2014 coup in Ukraine. Whether you're talking about, I don't know, the censorship during the Cold War, we could start there. That existed. Censorship during World War I, where we were censoring, or censorship during the Civil War, as Lincoln raided many different publications. Censorship by Andrew, I think it was Andrew Jackson, did actually go and raid some publications that were critical of him. Politicians who have proposed, banning political cartoons that depict politicians as animals, only to then be depicted in every single political cartoon as an animal. There's a million different places you could say, here's where the U.S. government got started and involved in censorship, where before it was like free speech heaven. It was never free speech heaven. In relation to other countries, for most of America's existence, it was generally more liberal when it comes to freedom of expression, and we have it written into the Constitution in a way that many other countries don't. But 2014? At least go back to, like, I don't know, the Bush era and the war on terror or something. 2014 was when it happened? Okay. The coup and counter coup.
The coup was great for internet free speech. I mean, you really do need to start the story of internet censorship with the story of internet freedom, because promotion of censorship is sort of the flip side of promotion of free speech. And we've had this free speech government diplomatic role for 80 years now. When World War II ended, we embarked, we had the international rules-based order that was created in 1948. We had the UN, we had NATO, we had the IMF, the World Bank. We had this big global system now. There was a prohibition in 1948 under the UN Declaration of Human Rights that you can't acquire territory by military force anymore and have it be respected by international law. So everything had to move to soft power influence. And so the U.S. government took a very active role beginning in 1948 to promote free speech around the world. And this was done through all these, initially CIA proprietaries like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And then the whole Wisner's, Wurlitzer, State Department CIA apparatus, all the early partnerships with the media and the war machine around propaganda for World War II continued through the Cold War. And then that hit the gas with promotion of free speech on the internet when the internet was privatized. It was initially a military project, so it was a government operation from Jump Street. And then in 1991, the World Wide Web came out, civilian use. And right away, with the State Department, the military, our intelligence sphere was promoting free speech so that we could have a basically government pressure on foreign countries to open up their internet, to allow basically groups that the U.S. government was supporting to be able to combat state control over media in those other countries. So we already had this sort of deep interplay between government, tech companies, universities, NGOs that dates back 80 years. If you look at the evolution of NGOs like Freedom House or the Atlantic Council or Wilson Center in promoting these free speech things. So, but what happened is in 2014, we had about 25 years of successful free speech diplomacy. And then there was we tried to overthrow the government of Ukraine. We successfully did. And I'm not even arguing whether that's a good or a bad thing. But the fact is the U.S. did effectively January 6th, the Yanukovych government out of power in 2014. I mean, we literally had our Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, handing out cookies and water bottles to violent street protesters as they surrounded the Parliament building and ran the democratically elected government out of office. But then what happened is...
Okay, so to be clear, you're a Joe Rogan viewer. Average Joe Rogan viewer, I will imagine, is not a scholar on Ukrainian history. What do you take from this? This, for a lot of people, is their full history of Euromaidan. The full history of Euromaidan. That what he just said, and he should realize that, considering the audience he's talking to, is what they are going to believe. Oh, that's what Euromaidan was. Euromaidan was a CIA coup, American coup, maybe not CIA, but someone in the American deep state that went in there and we overthrew the Ukrainian government. We directed these protesters to destroy the Yanukovych regime and storm the Parliament building. And what's the evidence? Victoria Nuland was handing out cookies and water bottles as they surrounded the Parliament building. To be clear, it wasn't just Victoria Nuland. It was John McCain. It was a few other people that went there and talked to them. But Victoria Nuland was also working for the United States as helping try to mediate a deal between the Yanukovych regime and the opposition that was opposing him. Like, for example, like the Klitschko deal and et cetera, the deal that Klitschko was supporting. Now, I don't know how any reading of events that is honest, and I know we've confronted this, like, America overthrew the government lie, and I'm just going to call it a lie, because that's what it is. It's a lie. Many times. But let's just be clear what's being talked about as the real substantive evidence here. The substantive evidence is that Victoria Nuland handed out water bottles. I do not care. John McCain gave a speech. It doesn't mean John McCain overthrew the government. A foreign politician entering a country, meeting people, talking to people, or making a speech does not equal a coup. John McCain, as much, I know he was a veteran, he can't storm the Capitol on his own. And he did not organize those people to storm the Capitol. To storm or to fight with the Tishtushki or to fight with the riot police.
John Brown Enthusiast has donated $5.69. The great philosopher George Carlin had plenty of ideas of how to deal with these white-collar criminals.
I don't know who you're talking to, but thank you about what you're talking about. Or but I appreciate the $5. Thank you, John Brown. I know George Carlin, I just don't know what that's in reference to. So, her handing out water bottles, Victoria Nuland, it doesn't mean anything. Victoria Nuland was there to be, at best, okay, at worst, the eyes for the United States in the country to get an idea of what was going on and then maybe help mediate discussions. She was not directing a coup. She did not hand out guns or bombs or direct weapons into the rebels. We didn't direct weapons. There's been no evidence of that provided. What the United States did was signal diplomatic support for the protesters who were being murdered and beaten, as well as having a few of their politicians, including John McCain, who has always been a Russia hawk, go there and make some noise. To be quite frank with you, I think Obama would be, and this is the blunt way to say it, he was too scared of the Russians to do such a thing. In my mind. Not only have we no evidence that the United States overthrew the government, that we also don't have any evidence that Obama was particularly interested in going through with a coup because of the fear of escalation. And once the Russians invaded, what support did Obama provide? He sent 0 offensive weapons out of fear of escalation. So to be clear, Obama would be willing to overthrow a pro-Russian government in Ukraine and anger the Russians who were at that moment trying to strangle Ukraine trade-wise to make them stop from entering the association agreement. That's why Yanukovych pulled out of the deal in the middle of the night. Pull out of the association agreement with the EU that would allow visa-free travel and all these other things in the middle of the night to try to suppress protests. And then it gets violent, then they kill people, then the government hires gangs. These are all things, by the way, that I think would be more motivating for somebody to go, fight against the police or call for change than, say, Victoria Nuland handing you a fucking cookie, okay? I think that your protest friends getting killed or you being hit with batons or having flashbangs with nails tied to them thrown into the crowd or hiring gangs to help put down the protest, real thing that happened, real thing, look it up. I think all of these are things that would be more likely to push people towards protest. Or Yanukovych going back on his promise. Yanukovych allowing the Budapest Memorandum to be torn in half through Russia's economic coercion, which they promised not to do. Yanukovych subservience to the Russians, which many people saw as selling out the country. I mean, there's a million different things that motivated people to go out there before you get to Victoria Nuland's cookies, right? Now, the backdrop on this is always the non-governmental agencies that we fund, like stuff through the National Endowment of Democracy. That's the end here, right? But before we get there, I just want to quickly say, do you really think if Obama was too scared to give the Ukrainians guns once the Russians invaded, how was he not scared enough to overthrow the government? It doesn't make any sense to me. Does it make any sense to you? Barack Obama, who was too scared to go through with the Syria actions, going in there and deposing Assad because he didn't have the support at home, that guy is going to go in and overthrow the Ukrainian government, but he's not willing to send them weapons? Why would you overthrow the government and then let them get invaded and then do? What was the point? What was the point if you want to get a pro-Western government there, if all that it ends up doing at the end of the day is you rolling back and being like, okay, take Crimea. You can have the naval base there. You can have all the strategically important stuff there. Okay, yeah, invade the Donbass, invade Luhansk, do all this. And by the way, they invaded. They invaded Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. People talk about the rebels in Crimea. There were rebels in Crimea. A lot of them gangs, but some of them true Russian nationalists. They weren't the majority in Donetsk, but they were certainly there. But when they started to get collapsed, the Russians invaded Ukraine. What did the United States do when the Russians invaded Ukraine? We did nothing. The closest we ever got to sending them offensive military aid was radar systems so the Ukrainians could see themselves get bombed on a screen. So I call bullshit on the coup. We have yet to have any physical evidence of funneling of weapons. We have yet to have any evidence of our government directing people to overthrow the government. The closest we got are two things. Number one, a phone call by Victoria Nuland, and number two, the National Endowment for Democracy. We're going to get through this quickly because I want to make sure that we get to the other stuff. I really do want to make sure that we get to the other stuff. Now, the phone call with Victoria Nuland, basically, in this phone call, Victoria Nuland talks about how she wants a certain politician, she favors a certain politician taking over once it's all said and done. And I think it was, I forget, it wasn't Poroshenko. It was the person that was between Poroshenko and, Yanukovych. And because that person ended up taking power, the idea is, oh my God, she installed him. They chose the next leader. But that would be like Putin saying, I want Donald Trump to be president, or I want RFK to be president, or whoever he says, but Donald Trump, for the example, obviously. And then Trump becomes president. Did Putin install Trump? Or did Putin look at an option from two candidates, Harris and Trump, favored one, and said, I favor this person? Well, and of course, he did some American manipulation when it comes to media and stuff like that, and disinformation, but he didn't install Trump. Trump won. Whether there was disinformation out there, put that aside. Trump won. He was not installed. So I need to see evidence that this person was installed. We're going to go off the Victoria Nuland phone call. As for the National Endowment for Democracy, none of it went to weapons. None of it went to guns. It went to things like, for example, training poll watchers to watch elections. Because in 2004, there was a huge scandal that led to the Orange Revolution about not only one of the candidates being attempted assassination on their life, which many people tie back to the Russians because it was a poisoning, and by God, do they love the poison. And then the stealing of the election, which the courts in Ukraine decided, yeah, it was stolen, or there was enough evidence that it could have been stolen, that we had to have a redo. They had a redo, and then the other guy won. So it was some fun poll watchers. It was a fun local media apparatuses, so like local news covering local news issues. And you could be like, well, some of this money obviously went to pro-Western groups that covered pro-Western news that had an influence in Ukraine. Okay, you know what? That's possible. And you know what? I would even say it's likely. But guess what? I would still not say Trump couped the government with the help of the Russians in 2024 because the Russians spread misinformation in the United States. I would not say that because it would be silly. It would be stupid. The thing that caused those protests to get out of control wasn't Victoria Nuland's cookies or the National Endowment for Democracy or John McCain. It was the pulling out of the association agreement that Yanukovych promised in 2012 he was going to enter with the European Union to give more Ukrainians economic opportunities. He pulls out of it in the middle of the night to try to suppress protests. Protesters go out there and are brutally beat down by the police. The public do not react to it well. It swells and swells and swells and swells as a protest movement, and the rest is history. They only know how to respond to it with violence. They only know how to respond to it with force. They end up killing a bunch of people. And at that point, no matter what they offered, I think it was done. I think that the people were not going to accept anything but Yanukovych stepping down. And Yanukovych, instead of stepping down, he decided to fly away. And that's the history. Nowhere here have we been able to find evidence of this, of that there was a coup. And like, he didn't go in there to say, yeah, we had National Endowment of Democracy money that could have pushed the public maybe a little bit more in a pro-left and a pro-West direction, or yada, yada, yada. He said, we did a coup because of Victoria Nuland's cookies. I'm sure if we had a longer conversation that went into this specifically, he'd talk about the National Endowment for Democracy. He'd talk about the Victoria Nuland phone call. But this is a butchering of the history of Euromaidan. And this is the only perspective Joe Rogan viewers are going to get from here. Has Joe Rogan had on a pro-Ukrainian? I think the last one I remember was Peter Zeihan. I think that's the last person I can recall. And that wasn't a discussion about Euromaidan or the type of history. It was always, through his like, well, this is how geography means this is going to happen, I hate to butcher Peter Zeihan like that, but come on. So these people are learning about Euromaidan for the first time, and from their perspective, it's like, America just overthrew the government. Well, by God, if you're the Russians and we just overthrow the government and then they talk about joining NATO, that would seem provocative, huh? Says the Joe Rogan viewer at home. Putting out all of the crucial information. How do you talk about the American Revolution? Imagine you just talk about the American Revolution. You say, well, the American Revolution, the French went in there and they were like, we want to, bust up the British. And so they did this like proxy group in America called the Revolutionaries. And then they beat them back until, it won. Wait a second. What about representation without taxation? Wait a second. What about the fact that the revolution happened before the French supported it? Just like Euromaidan happened before you could even dream that Victoria Nuland handed out cookies or had a phone call or whatever. Where is the proper context being provided? It's not being provided on the show. And look, okay, if this guy's going to spin this type of a yarn, I don't expect him to provide it. But you would at least expect Joe Rogan to at least have somebody on the other side of the aisle, if he does not know if this is the truth or not, and he says he doesn't want to have propagandists on, he doesn't want to have propaganda, he doesn't want to have Zelensky on, then have somebody on to give the Ukrainian perspective. A month and 3/4 away. That is when Trump's walking into the White House and he said he'd end the war in 24 fucking hours. If that happens, shouldn't the American public be somewhat informed about what would be good for the future stability of the country? Wouldn't it suck if he was able to pull the wool over our eyes, say a bad deal was a good deal and the war starts again in 5 years because none of us fucking listened, and we either listened to the same people who got us here in the first place, or we listened to the people who started the war in the first place? Like, neither of these are good. We shouldn't be going by the Russian terms, and we shouldn't be going by the people who got us here in the first place. And we shouldn't be going by pseudo-history either to inform our positions. And this is one of the largest podcasts, if not the largest podcast in the United States. And this is what people are learning about the war in Ukraine. Why do you think support for Ukraine in the United States has fallen? It's still the majority, but why do you think it is? I think it could be many things: tiredness of the war, personal issues making people think, well, why are we sending aid here if I got this issue at home? And even though I could have the argument about, I don't think bringing back that M113 troop carrier from Vietnam is going to give you health care, to the individual, they're worried about their kitchen table issues. And, the future of Chasiv Yar is probably not immediately present in that. Even though, of course, we're interconnected and European instability would hurt the United States. For most people, it's what's directly in front of them. And this is what's shoveled to them. No bueno.
The eastern side of the state completely broke away. So we don't respect this new U.S.-installed government. Crimea voted in a referendum to join the Russian Federation. And that kicked off...
What do I even do with this, man? This is not retelling the events. What do you mean they voted to join the Russian Federation? How do you ignore the Russian invasion of Crimea? They invaded. Igor Girkin, Strelkov, who was there during the invasion of Crimea, said that he held Crimean politicians at gunpoint to make them dissolve. The vote in Crimea was rigged. It was rigged. I don't care what anyone says. It was rigged. It was obviously rigged. 94%. There was no polling pre-invasion that ever indicated that it was anywhere close to that. You go by any data. The UN data indicates it was like roughly 50-50, right? So roughly 50-50, and then you got like a section of the population that wants like autonomous. So it's not like roughly 50-50. There's like, basically, it's a plurality. You got like 40% here, and like 10% in the middle who are like autonomous, and a certain amount of people like, I don't know, So how do you get 94% out of that? How is that the result you get? That's not even talking about all the people who protested the vote, like, for example, the Tatar Council, which is the people who've been in Crimea before the Russians, they've been there for a very, very long time, who have been ethnically cleansed by the Soviet Union, and the Tatar Council said they weren't going to participate because they didn't think it was legitimate and they didn't believe the vote was going to be respected. And then soon after, their activists were found bloated, their bodies in the river floating down, found by their families. And so your classification is, they voted to leave. As if it was like, everybody was just like, I always wanted to be a Russian. Crimea voted in majority to leave the Soviet Union, to become part of Ukraine, 54%, back in the 1990s. Now, maybe that doesn't mean much to you, but it means much to a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of the people in Crimea who will not be able to go back to their homes. And it would be, and while, of course, like the idea of Ukraine taking back Crimea, well, I won't say it's physically impossible, it is not the most likely outcome in the immediate future. This is, like, don't they deserve some respect, some mention, the people who were suppressed, and not pretending that this sham election was anything other than a sham? Don't just say that there were a sizable amount of the population who wanted to be part of Russia. Say that. That I can believe. I know it's true. Everyone knows that's true. Why do you have to extend and then use a fake bullshit election? Like, why can I just host my own election and say Joe Biden won, but we don't need Trump in there? Can we just do that now? Is it that easy?
That sort of set in motion the events that would end the concept of free speech diplomacy is like a U.S. government unfettered good. Because what they argued is
So we ended that free speech is good because the Russians invaded Ukraine and the Ukrainians didn't like their corrupt, butcherous government. Sorry to use the emotive words, butcherous and such, but I mean, like, do you think it was the dead bodies or do you think it was Victoria Nuland's cookies, chat? What do you think would motivate you more personally? Your brother getting shot or a cookie? I'm sorry to be like, I'm being sassy, but I don't know how to treat this with respect because it's, that being the classification you give that audience is just irresponsible.
we pumped $5 billion worth of U.S. government money into media institutions in Ukraine. That's the figure that's cited by Victoria Nuland in December 2013, right before the coup. $5 billion setting up independent media companies.
Was it $5 billion into the National Endowment of Democracy, which then went into different groups, which included media companies, or $5 billion post-Soviet collapse? So we were talking about like 20-something years. Like, what are we, when we say 5 billion, I'll look this up while he's talking, because I don't know about the 5 billion number. I know about the National Endowment for Democracy number. I don't know about the 5 billion number.
Basically sponsoring Mockingbird style our media assets in the region, and they still didn't penetrate eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was primarily ethnic Russian, didn't penetrate Crimea, so they said, we need something.
But by the way, this is also a lie. God damn, can he tell the truth? Can this guy... Joe Rogan, you said you didn't want to have propagandists on. It is true they didn't penetrate Crimea because it's basically like a lot of it's just a giant fucking Russian naval base. So it's kind of hard to directly invade it. And you have to go down this narrow passageway, which is basically just a kill zone if you start putting convoys over that bridge or through these narrow passageways trying to get into Crimea from Ukrainian mainland. But in Donetsk and Luhansk, this is just bullshit. The rebels, quote unquote, overthrew the local council. They took over the government buildings. A lot of them were like former criminals. A lot of them were FSB agents. Some of them were locals who were not criminals, even though there were also local criminals involved, gangs and such. And they were also Russian nationalist paramilitaries. For example, Rusich got its start around this time. The Russian Orthodox Army, which executed Baptists and persecuted religious minorities and did a bunch of these different groups go in there. They're fighting, some of them local, some of them criminal, some of them Russian. And they get shellacked. I'm sorry, but I think most people forget what happened in 2014. They just remember what the border was at the end. The Ukrainians were winning. I know this is wild to remember now, thinking it's how it is now, but the Ukrainians had encircled the city of Donetsk. They liberated Kramatorsk. They liberated Avdiivka. And they were moving to liberate the city of Donetsk. They had encircled the city. And once they had encircled the city, and it was clear that the Russian proxy state, whatever, if you want to use that type of word, was created, was going to collapse and be occupied in their mind, liberated in the Ukrainian mind, obviously. The Russians sent their army across the border, and who would have thought it, one of the most powerful armies in the world, against a country dealing with immense corruption issues and command, let's just say, inept command, was not able to deal with it. It also didn't help that the Ukrainian army was full of Russian spies. That took them like a decade to purge a lot of them, but not even all of them. We still every once in a while find that there was a Russian spy that's been in there for like 10 years or something. Every once in a while. And his thing is like, oh, they didn't make a dent? Does he even know the history? Has he, like, we gotta like find like a map of the war in the Donbass. Map of timeline, war in Donbass. Like, this is not like unknown history. This was... Where did he get this guy? Where did they get this guy? I can't find there's a map that I saw that I really liked because it showed like day by day by day the border changes and how once the Russian soldiers entered, like the entire situation reversed. But the point is, the only time the situation reversed and the Russians were able to actually make Donetsk a defendable rebel stronghold was when the Russian army illegally invaded Ukraine. After they illegally invaded Crimea, which he just described as the Russian, as them voting to leave. Again, Joe Rogan doesn't want propaganda. Joe Rogan doesn't want propaganda. No Zelensky. No Zelensky. No Zelensky. So this guy, yeah, no, that's fine. That's good. That's cool. That's fine. Look, I'm not even asking to not have on schmucks like this anymore. I think that's too much to ask of Joe Rogan, okay? Just have someone on who can give the Ukrainian perspective and be like, no, you know, I fought in that battle and I remember taking back that city. We did make a dent. And here, like, I could tell you this city we took, this city we took, and then the Russians got in, and who would have thunk it? You know, the Russian army, a country like, what, 20 times the size of Ukraine, with like 6 to 7 times the population, that didn't just have to fight through all this rebel territory, so they're fresh and well-rested. Yeah, they were able to push them back. Big surprise. But even at the end of that, they only controlled 1/3 of both Donetsk and Luhansk. So what does that say? Even with the Russian army, the most they can manage was 1/3 of the country before Minsk I and Minsk II and all this other stuff started kicking in. It's, come on, like, it's not hard to just, like, look at a timeline before, like, quickly going on the show or something. Like, this is a big platform. Might be the biggest platform in this man's life, honestly.
To stop them from being able to combat our media influence. And they initially called this the Gerasimov Doctrine.
Also, how is that supposed to work? We funnel a bunch of media into Ukraine, and that means they take back Donbass. What? These two things aren't even related. So we're willing to, like, yap through our NGOs to help them take back Donbass, but we're not willing to send them guns? Just send, why wouldn't we? Hey, if you can't take back Donbass, here's some artilleries, here's some tanks, here's this, here's that, here's some American advisors. It's not like we haven't done that before. Why wouldn't we just do that then? Hell, we even had the Budapest Memorandum. We had a legal justification, an agreement that the Russians and the Ukrainians signed saying that if the territory of Ukraine is threatened, you come to help them. So we had a foundation, we had a justification too, but we didn't, because I think Obama was scared to. But he was apparently very scared to send a single gun, but not scared at all to overthrow the government.
Doctrine named after Valery Gerasimov, who was this Russian general. They took a quote from him saying, "The new nature of war is no longer about military to military conflict. All we need to do is take over the media in these NATO countries, and that's primarily social media. Get one of our pawns elected as the president, and that president will control the military. So it's much cheaper and more efficient to win a military war by simply winning civilian elections." So that was called the Gerasimov Doctrine. That's what set up the early censorship infrastructure in 2014. 3 years later, the guy who coined that, Mark Galeotti, would write a sort of mea culpa saying, oops, I'm sorry. Gerasimov was actually citing what the U.S. does. But by that point, they'd already renamed it hybrid warfare, NATO.
To be clear, the Russians do that. The Russians try to get certain candidates in elections elected. They tried to do it in Moldova. They tried to do it in the United States. I mean, it's not, this isn't like a secret.
NATO formally declared its tanks to tweets doctrine, saying that the new role of NATO is no longer just about tanks, it's about controlling tweets. And then Brexit happened in June 2016. In July 2016, the very next month in Warsaw, NATO added hybrid warfare to its formal charter, basically authorizing the military, the diplomatic sphere, and the intelligence world to take control over social media. And then 5 months later, Trump won the election, being called a Russian asset. So all that infrastructure was redirected home to the U.S.
Jesus, that is the Joe Rogan commentary. Jesus, because he doesn't know. He doesn't know. And of course Joe Rogan wouldn't know. It's not his like his specialization. But that's why he brings people on like this. In order to try to, learn more. At least that's the idea. That's supposed to be the idea. Like, this wasn't even like an attempt at being fair and balanced. I couldn't find the map that I wanted to show you guys, but you guys can look at it yourself. I mean, Donetsk being surrounded briefly is not like a unknown story. Let's do one more of this, just to get the point home. There's another segment where he talks about Zelensky's unpopularity in Ukraine.
So when you say that Ukraine no longer has democracy, essentially what happened is Zelensky was supposed to leave office and he did not. Is that what happened?
Well, they've indefinitely canceled elections. So he is
because of the war.
Because of the wars there.
Because of martial law. Because in the Ukrainian constitution, when they were writing it, they included a provision that elections could be temporarily suspended during a martial law period. And if you wanted to change that, I mean, you could try to have an election and try to get all these people who are in Ukraine to vote, but what about all the diaspora? How are you going to organize the infrastructure to make sure they vote? I mean, that happens in other countries, but Ukraine has a gigantic diaspora right now, and it's not like they have long running back addresses. These are new refugees, you know, so you got to go get all that. And let me tell you, Ukrainian bureaucracy is not really known for its efficiency, so good luck with that. But then what about the people in occupied territory? Do they get a vote? Do they get a say? I mean, even if you wanted to have a vote on something as simple as, do we continue the war or accept Russian concessions? Which at this point, polling data can suggest that they would not accept all of Russia's demands if you ask the Ukrainian people. Even though most would like to negotiate peace, if you ask them, okay, what about accepting Russia? They'll say, no. Even if you were to try to do that, don't the people who are in the land that is being occupied get a say? Like, it's like having an election is a little bit more difficult in a war, especially when, you know, the other side has regularly targeted civilians. And what are you going to do? Are you going to have like long voting lines that could be targeted? Do you think the Russians would not take the opportunity to target it? Do you think the Russians would not try to take the opportunity to delegitimize the election? You can have an election during wartime. The American Civil War, like during the American Civil War, we had an election. But it's also, we didn't have the same constitutional provisions written into our Constitution. What was written into the, you know, in Great Britain, there was no elections during World War II. They didn't have them. They canceled them the same way that Ukraine did because they were at war. And it was a period of extensive strife, and so they put that aside until the war was over, then had an election, Churchill lost, Labour won, the rest is history. So when we say Ukraine is no longer a democracy, what we mean is Ukraine has paused its democracy. Not that, you know, there's no more elections or there's not going to be ever election again. They've done the same thing the UK done. Now, if you still think they should do it the way Lincoln did, and they should still have the elections and figure it out anyway, smuggle the votes into occupied territory, discount those votes entirely, build the infrastructure to get the diaspora, the millions and millions and millions of people in refugee places all around the world. Okay, but let's hold them to the same standard we hold our allies, at least, or at least mention the fact that this is pretty typical.
Argument. Now, we had elections during the Civil War here in the U.S. This is, this is not uncommon for countries to be at war and still have elections. The issue is Zelensky is unpopular and not winning in those election polls. And we no longer define democracy as being about elections because elections allow populists to circumvent the consensus of institutions.
Okay, so Trump winning by less than 50% of the vote, that is a record landslide. He won by less than Joe Biden did in 2020, but that isn't a landslide, of course. But is a record landslide, even though historically it really isn't. But it's a record landslide. Record landslide when he's polling popularity-wise at like 40-something. Zelensky is still trusted by the majority of Ukrainians. President Zelensky continues to command the trust of nearly 6 in 10 Ukrainians, with support remaining stable in recent months. So to be clear, that's a 20% difference between him and Trump. So Trump can win with 40%. Zelensky can't win with 60%. Understood. A poll released by the Kiev Institute of Sociology found, according to the survey results released, 59% of Ukrainians polled hold trust in Zelensky, while 37% distrust the president. Another 3% respondents are unsure. The results are virtually unchanged from another survey in May, but down from the high of 64% in February. Levels of trust in Zelensky have continually decreased from his high record of 90% in May of 2020, just months following the start of the invasion. At the time, only 7% of respondents said they did not trust the president. The current polling numbers draw a stark contrast with the level of support for the president this time last year, which was 76%. So it's true that support has decreased, but most Ukrainians still support Zelensky, or still thinks he should stay in power until the end of the war, or trust him. The polling data on that is pretty clear. I don't know where he gets this idea from. It's completely out of his ass. He takes it from literally nowhere. Now, the only thing I could think of, and this would be dishonest if this was his point, is that there are some polls that indicate that there is one person that could beat him in an election, and that is Valery Zaluzhny. Batko nash Zaluzhny, yeah? Our former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Now, that guy is popular because he's a fucking war hero. It's like Dwight D. Eisenhower running for office. Patton. Well, Patton probably would have said a bunch of stuff about the Jews and would have gotten weird really quick. But Eisenhower. So, for me, if the point was there's actually one person who has yet to announce if he would even enter the political realm, because guess what? Not everyone wants to be president. I know for every politician, that's, oh boy, that's the top. But somebody could be like, I don't want to be president. He's currently the ambassador to the United Kingdom. So the point was not expressed. There is one person who has yet to announce if he would even participate in an election that could beat him if an election was to take place. He says that most Ukrainians don't support Zelensky. Zelensky. That's not true. Most still trust him. Most still think he should stay in power. And I think, presumably, barring a run from Zelensky, and even under those circumstances, I don't know for sure, because Zelensky is just known as a war hero. Once you have to come out and start... Remember Ron DeSantis, when he had all that high polling, he came out and then he talked a little? And then, dude, remember that? I'm not saying that Zelensky is a bad guy or demon or whatever. I'm just saying he goes out there and he starts saying... like, no, abortion, smortion, or some crazy, he starts saying some positions he has that might not be held with by the vast majority of the population, might change things. Point is, this is just not true. Zelensky is still supported by the majority of the Ukrainian people, whether he deserves it or not. So again, this is another lie. Look, we had another thing pulled up. Like, every single aspect of Ukrainian society is controlled by U.S. democratic institutions. If that's the case, why haven't we done mobilization? By God, if we control the Ukrainians, why haven't we just flipped the switch and made them mobilize their 18-year-olds? You're like, oh, demographic crisis, smisis. You're mobilizing those boys. Like, why wouldn't we do that? Jake Sullivan has openly expressed dissatisfaction at the fact that they aren't mobilizing the people they're not mobilizing enough people. But Zelensky doesn't want to, because he doesn't want to be blunt, he doesn't want to bring up the normalcy that many Ukrainians are still able to somewhat hold on to if they grip tight enough as missiles and drones are thrown at major cities. But that's still not anything in comparison to being on the front, because it's bad there. So he wants to preserve a sense of normalcy, but also his demographic future, because there's not a lot of young Ukrainians around in comparison to older Ukrainians, because, well, post-Soviet Union, there was a big collapse demographically. It was a big issue. But I still think they could mobilize 30,000 or 40,000 young people and not destroy the demographic future of the country. But for political reasons, for demographic reasons, for a bunch of different reasons, they have made the decision not to do what the United States asked of them. Do you think they would have invaded Kursk if the United States asked them to do that? And if they did, why wouldn't we have given them the weapons necessary to do it well? Why wouldn't we have approved long-range strikes, which could have really fucked up Russian logistics as they were responding to it, and then maybe they would have taken Glushkovo? Maybe they would have, and then they'd have a much more defensible position protected by a river. Why would we... there's so many different decisions that the Ukrainians made that we don't agree with. For example, the defense of Bakhmut. A lot of American generals and American commentators and the American government did not like the idea of defending Bakhmut. They thought it was a fool's errand, that the city is not particularly important for Ukraine's defense, but as the battle went on and the Ukrainians did not want to give up an inch of land, the city then took on a really big symbolic importance, and to the point where there's like popular songs about Bakhmut, that you constantly hear on the radio and such. But they defended it anyway for, issues of morale, one might say, political reasons. They wanted to grind down. I remember at the time the statement was, we're killing more of them than they're killing of us, so the math works out. But the American government didn't like it. They didn't like it because they thought they were going to waste lives defending a not particularly defensible city that is not of extreme strategic importance. Bakhmut matters as a city, as the population, the homes matter. But we didn't like that. Why didn't we change? Why didn't we make them change? Why didn't we change them? Why didn't we tell them, pull out. This is nonsense. Don't do that. It's hard. This is nonsense. If we controlled those institutions, the Ukrainian government would not have fought the war as they have. They'd be fighting it a totally different way. I'm sure a lot of it would stay the same because there's a consistent logic that both sides could see, but there'd be certain decisions, particularly one that has to do with domestic political consideration, that would have been disregarded, especially If it, as this guy says, Zelensky's already not popular anyway, then what does it matter if they mobilize another 10 to 20, 30, 40,000 from the nation's youth? Joe Russia Today Rogan decided to have this guy on after complaining about propaganda and not wanting to have Zelensky on for that reason, right? That was the justification. But then ended up platforming propaganda in a different form, full of multiple lies that are easily disprovable by anyone with a basic knowledge of the conflict. If there's anybody that was listening to this that was Ukrainian or knew anything about the war, you mean no dents in the rebels in Donbass? What are you talking about? Victoria Nuland overthrew the government? You just hear these things in these alt media circles so many times over. Nobody sits down and really dissects it or takes it apart or looks at it any deeper. And, you know, if you're going to be the you're going to be the anti-deep state guy, you want to be the dude who's not going to kowtow to the establishment, man, you got to ask a few more questions than just let this guy spin his yarn. You've got to at least have somebody on there who's going to maybe show it a different perspective. I mean, look, people talk about, like, the big lie in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction, but they don't want to get to Saddam, like, kind of purposefully making it so it's hazy on whether he has weapons. None of that matters. What matters is the government said that we had pretty solid proof that they had it. We invaded, and they didn't. Now, if people were wrong about that, it might have been useful if you were a show host at the time to have on people who would show the alternative perspective and create a dialogue in the country about, oh, well, wait, I don't know, do they have nukes? How certain are we they actually have nukes? What's this intelligence we cannot see? If we have this type of knowledge getting passed out to the American public, we're not setting them up to be prepared and educated when the war negotiations come around. Oh, Donetsk and Luhansk, they couldn't make up debt, so what does it matter there? What does it matter, all those people who just been displaced from Donetsk? All those Baptists that had their churches shut down as they were either killed or forced out. All those people who would like to return to their homes or not like to lose it again, as they're now facing possible evacuation from their homes in Kramatorsk, in Slovansk, and these other locations if the Russian army keeps advancing. Of course, Pokrovsk, many have already left. I was there. It was like a ghost town most of the time, honestly. It's like a ghost town. But if you just think, oh, well, you know, they're all Russian over there, so, I mean, they all basically support Russia over there, it doesn't matter. Then when the Russians demand, we want all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, all oblasts that don't have the entirety of it controlled by the Russians. Kherson still has the city of Kherson, which is constantly being hit by Russian drones, and what the locals have called a human safari, where they're practicing on civilians and then posting videos on it on social media. Both of my embeds to Kherson have left me, honestly, pretty disgusted and horrified leaving, and I've seen some awful stuff here, and heard some awful stuff here. Or Zaporizhia, a city of hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom will have to be forced to leave their home if the demand of give us all of the oblast is made. Or what about the city of Kramatorsk, the city of Sloviansk? When we just say, oh, you know, they had a vote. Oh, well, you know, they're kind of all Russian speakers anyway. Someone can speak Russian and not support Russia. If you tell an Irish person, hey, you know, are you British? I mean, you seem to be speaking some English. They're not going to be very happy with you. Of course, there are people who support the Russians, but this is reductive to a point of misinforming with a layered on top of lies. And this is not somebody informing people about the war. This is people giving, this is a person giving viewers negative knowledge about the war in Ukraine. Now, I don't think Joe Rogan did this necessarily maliciously. I'm trying to be kumbaya polite here. I don't think he did this maliciously, but it's very hard for me to believe that Joe Rogan can't have on some people who show the other side of the aisle here, you know, the Ukrainian perspective. He can't do that for propaganda reasons if this is the type of people he's having on his show.
Strange. Give me a moment here. Technical difficulties as always. I'm a boomer when it comes to this stuff. Absolutely. Boomer coded. Do.